right, welcome back, A-Push historians. We're going to continue the next period, period 3, 1754, the start of the French Indian War, and it's going to go to 1800. We actually are going to cover period 3 in a couple of different sections. We'll have a couple of different tests over this period. Our intro music, I frankly have no idea who they're from. They're French. It sounded French. I struggled to find a good connection, and that's all you got. A little heads up as well, this might be the longest video of the year because we are going to cover the entire chapter in this one video. Pretty much for every other chapter, we are going to have it broken down into two different parts. So chapter 6 covers the French and Indian War, and the chapter heading and title is The Duel for North America, 1608 to 1763. And the biggest event in this chapter is the French and Indian War. Here's the quote from Voltaire, a French philosopher, in 1756, and he said, "A torch lighted in the forests of America set all Europe in conflagration." So basically, Voltaire is saying that this war, which becomes a world war, begins in America. Geography is so important to understanding the French and Indian War, and so this map shows North America in the year 1750. This is 4 years before the French and Indian War begins. So the map shows the three main European powers that settled North America. We've already talked about Spain in the southwest, England's 13 colonies along the east coast over here and up a little bit into Canada. And then the largest area was actually controlled by France, and that included the St. Lawrence River up here in Canada, down through the Great Lakes in the Ohio Valley region, and into the Great Plains. This area becomes known as Louisiana. Also note that Florida during this time is controlled by Spain, and in the West Indies with the very valuable sugar plantations, they were controlled by Spain and a little bit by England, Jamaica, and the Bahamas, and France also had a colony in the West Indies as well. First section for your reading is France finds a foothold in Canada, and we need to understand the French. It's a big part of A-Push, and so partly why this chapter begins in 1608 is it begins with the settlement of Quebec, the first settlement. And here are some important questions that I just wanted to highlight before going over the section in detail. Okay, so the first question is, how was the relationship between the French and the American Indians, specifically the Huron? They had a good relationship. Okay, that's very important. Unlike the Spanish, and especially unlike the English, the French had a good relationship, mostly because of the fur trade. The French were probably the biggest European power that tried to control the fur trade, and so they needed the Native Americans to help them with the trade. We looked at the map on the previous slide of New France, which was the St. Lawrence River, Ohio Valley, and into Louisiana. But let's look at the government of New France and maybe compare it to the English colonies. So New France was definitely controlled by the king. In the English colonies, that was not really the case. The king did appoint a royal governor, but didn't really have as much direct control, unlike New France. Thus, New France was autocratic, so you can basically say it was ruled by a dictator, which was the king. Also, unlike the English colonies, France had no elective representatives. And so we know that most of the English colonies did have a legislative branch that was elected by the people, especially the property holders. So this is not like the American colonies, and no trial by jury. That also is unlike the English colonies. So England really did not like how New France was being governed completely by the king. Okay, so this is some more detail of this section, and we mentioned that the French did colonize about the same time as the English. However, their colonies were not near as big as the English. Quebec was the first colony for New France, and it was very close to Jamestown only a year later. We talked about the friendly relationships because of the fur trade with Native Americans. And we've already looked at the map of New France and talked about that it was a large area of North America. And I think an important point, by 1750, there was only 60,000 French in New France. So it was a lot less populated than the English colonies. Okay, so here's another look at the map, and we already talked about the vast land area that New France controlled. Here's Quebec on the St. Lawrence River, and most of the population of New France was up here in present-day Canada, Quebec, and Montreal. Also want to mention that the French did control the mouth of the Mississippi River down here in New Orleans, and this is a very key city really throughout early American history, and the French controlled it prior to the French and Indian War. Okay, the next section is New France fans out. The most valuable resource of the French, this is important to know, is the beaver, because fur trading really makes the French colonies successful in New France. And it did allow for the improved relationship with Native Americans because the French recruited Indians into the fur business, and they were a huge help for the French for being successful with the fur trading. Also, religion is very important in the colonies. We already talked about the denominations in English colonies with the Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Anglicans. The French, however, were pretty much all Catholic. Okay, and these missionaries, the Jesuits, tried to convert Indians to Christianity. Now we know that the Spanish missionaries in the Southwest did attempt to convert the Indians to becoming Catholic, but they weren't very successful. An example of the unsuccessfulness was the Pueblo Revolt. However, the French were a lot more successful in converting them to Christianity. However, just like with the rest of North America, the Native Americans did struggle by diseases. That's a common theme. But also, many Native Americans were introduced to firewater, which is the nickname for alcohol. And unfortunately, many of the Native Americans became dependent upon the alcohol. And we're going to see that throughout much of American history, especially into the 1800s, when we put the Native Americans on reservations. Okay, and finishing up this slide, these French missionaries, these Catholics, became very important because they explored and they mapped the land for the French. And so that's partly why New France had so much land area, because these missionaries were exploring and also trying to improve the fur trade. We also mentioned New Orleans was very important for the French at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Okay, the next section is the clash of the empires, and so now there's going to be conflict with three major powers in North America. Eventually there's going to be conflict, and the conflict results in the French and Indian War, and we already talked about these are the three major colonial or European powers in North America. And during this time period of the 1700s, these nations fought each other all over the world. A lot of wars developed, especially between France and England, during this time period of the 1700s. An interesting side note is the War of Jenkins' Ear, which is around the year 1730s. And it's called that because the Spanish sliced off the English captain Jenkins' ear, and they told them to carry this home to your king. So here's the ear. Listen to us better. Okay, we talked about other three major powers. England and France most of the time were at war. The two powers that actually mostly allied with each other were France and Spain. Okay, their main common enemy were the English, especially during the 1700s. We're going to focus on the French and Indian War. I think you need to know these years. It was from 1754 with the first battle until the end of 1763. And during this time period, this war was also called the 7 Years' War, which is interesting because it lasted 9 years. Interesting. All right, a couple documents to look at. By 1700, we already talked about France had the most land area, and they're labeled in blue on this map. And look at the fur trading posts on this map. It's a little bit more clear on page 107. I just kind of threw this together, but these black dots represent the French fur trading posts, and they were throughout New France, and most of them were located along rivers. The Mississippi River here, or the Great Lakes here, the Mississippi up here, the Missouri out there. And finally, Rush Creek right through here. Seriously, I doubt that happened, but I just want to give a shout out to Hudsonville and Rush Creek. Go Eagles. Eagles. Everybody say Eagles. Eagles. Go Maize, go Blue. All right, the next section is George Washington inaugurates war with France in 1754. So this big war between France and England begins in 1754 with the founder of our country, George Washington, and the first battle of the French and Indian War. He did not win. And so let's go to our questions over here. Okay, a couple key questions. Number one, which area in North America became the biggest dispute? And it's the Ohio Valley region. I have an arrow here that actually should be a little bit more over here. The Ohio Valley is along the Ohio River, present-day Ohio, Pennsylvania, perhaps a little bit of West Virginia as well. That is the Ohio Valley region, and that's the part that was the biggest conflict between the English and French. Oh my goodness, that's where they kind of like meet right here, and they kind of wanted this land for the rivers and for their economies. I get it now. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, George Washington was the person in charge of the first group that fired the first shots in the French and Indian War, and that was at the battle called Fort Necessity. And so Washington lost, and he was able to get away without being killed and to regroup. But this is the first battle, Fort Necessity of the French and Indian War, and the English, not the Americans, the English lost because Americans, we were fighting on the side of the English. Okay, we already looked at some key questions to this section. Let's just continue. Again, the Ohio Valley becomes a hot spot for the French and English, and this is where most of the fighting is during this war. English settlers were moving deeper and deeper into this area, the Ohio Valley, mostly for land, especially in Virginia as well. They're looking for more land for their tobacco. And the French did not want to lose the Ohio Valley region because the Ohio Valley connected both parts of New France, up in Canada, down to the Louisiana, New Orleans, the Mississippi River. So losing Ohio would cause the French to be divided in half. So anyway, Washington basically is sent by the governor of Virginia to secure land claims in the Ohio Valley region, and unfortunately he runs into some French, and they have the first battle of the French and Indian War, and like we said, Washington lost, but he is able to retreat with his men. Okay, the next section is global war and colonial disunity, and so like I mentioned earlier, this is a world war. Okay, this happens throughout much of the world. North America is a big part of it, but also the war between the French and English also occurs in England. And colonial disunity, there was disunity in the colonies. Some colonists were not too excited to fight for the English because they just only cared about their own colony, not England as a whole. So because of this disunity between the colonists, many colonists called for a congress or a gathering or a meeting in the year 1754. This is called the Albany Congress. And so the British government called for this for all of the colonies to get together at Albany, New York. And of all the 13 colonies, only 7 came to this meeting in Albany. And there was only a total of 12 delegates representing the 7 colonies. And the purpose of the Albany Congress is unity, is a big purpose, to unite the colonies for common defense against the French and also the Native Americans as well, to support each other as they go into battle. And out of this Albany Congress is one of the most famous cartoons in American history in APUSH that you need to know. I'm telling you right now, it's probably going to be on your test for this period. And it's created by Ben Franklin, and it's called The Snake Cartoon. And it's also can be seen on page 112. And here it is, this beautiful work, this political cartoon, the Ben Franklin Join or Die cartoon. And so let's analyze. So obviously we have got a snake here. Okay, and the title of this is Join or Die, and so now we need to analyze the snake. The first thing we notice about the snake is that it is cut up into many pieces. Okay, so there are several pieces here. It's cut up, and it looks like that is going to kill the snake. Now let's look at what is written by each piece. And so we have NE right here, which probably represents New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, Carolina, and South Carolina. Okay, and so the point of this cartoon is that if the colonists stay separate and don't unite, they will all die from the French. And actually, maybe the most important thing about this cartoon is that it is not for the Revolution. Okay, that is this cartoon is during the French and Indian War, and it's for the colonies to unite against the French, not against the British. Okay, and so that could be something, especially later in the year when you take your exam, you have to keep that connection in mind that this deals with the French and Indian War. Although obviously it would also apply to the Revolution, but it was created in the 1750s. Getting into some details of the war, and in APUSH, unfortunately for those of you that love military history, there's very little military history on the APUSH exam, so you really do not focus much on that. We mostly focus on cause and effects, turning points in the war, and the results of major wars. And so in this war, it is the French and their Indian allies versus the British, the American colonists, and some of their Indian allies as well. In this section, we're going to talk about the first major offensive. We know that Washington was the first battle, Fort Necessity. This is the first major offensive where British generals, so this is on the side of the American colonists, led the first attack at Fort Duquesne, which is at present-day Pittsburgh, and the British and the American colonists lost. Okay, so the British struggled early on during this war, and eventually, after this loss, Native Americans raid American settlements from Pennsylvania down through North Carolina in the back country. So it was a bad defeat, a crushing defeat, and it continues for the British. Things are going bad by the year 1756. Here's a map of some of the major battles of the French and Indian War, and like I said, there's only a couple that you need to know. Most of them maybe is the First War, and potentially turning points in the last war. So we already talked about these two down here, both losses for the British, and the turning point battle is actually going to be Quebec. It's going to be a turning point. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But all these other wars, they're interesting, and some of you might love the French and Indian War battles, and they are kind of cool, but for a push, they're not extremely important. My favorite battle on this page is probably Ticonderoga, located in upstate New York, mostly because I like saying the word Ticonderoga. Ticonderoga. I'm done. Next section is Pitt's Palms for Victory, and so we have a great hero of the French and Indian War, and it is not George Washington, it's British leader William Pitt. So William Pitt saves the day. The British start to gain some victories by the year 1758. They win at Louisbourg, which is located in Nova Scotia, along the Atlantic Ocean. And then the turning point battle is the Battle of Quebec in 1759. And once the British capture Quebec, led by William Pitt, that is going to pretty much secure British victory against the French in North America. So after Quebec falls by the French, when the French are done in Quebec, the British go down the St. Lawrence River, they capture Montreal, and basically this signifies the end of the war in North America. The war does continue for a couple more years throughout the world and in Europe. But after the Montreal, it's pretty much decided in North America. In the Peace of Paris, the Paris Peace Treaty settles the war in 1763, and it delivers the results of this war. And the key thing about the Peace of Paris is the French are pretty much kicked out of North America, which is great, right? Maybe not. So continuing the section on Pitt's Palm of Victory, we'll look at the map on page 115, comparing before and after the French and Indian War. Again, significance is an important historical idea. And so what is the significance of the French and Indian War? And I think the most important one is this. The British ran up a huge debt. They had to pay for the war against the French. They had to pay for soldiers, they had to pay for supplies. Unfortunately, they went deep into debt to pay for the war, especially in North America. So that's a problem for the British. They're going to eventually need more money. Maybe we can get it by taxing the colonists. Hey, let's tax some of their stamps. Let's call it the Stamp Act. Let's start a revolution. Slightly off topic, sorry. Also, significance is resentment towards Americans by the British. Okay, so the British really did not like the Americans a whole lot during this war. They felt they were lazy, didn't do enough to help out the British cause. So there is some resentment that's going to carry over into the 1760s and 1770s as we get towards the revolution. And like finishing the final point, they needed new revenues, the British, because of their big war debt. And so they're going to start to tax the colonists. And the colonists are like, no taxation without, I don't know. You should know it. Okay, so here are two maps before the French and Indian War in 1754. We already talked about France controlled most of this region. English colonies, Spanish down here. All right, after the Peace of Paris, 1763, after the French and Indian War, all of this land here is controlled by the English. Here are the original 13 colonies, but English land claims did all the way go out to went all the way out to the Mississippi River and up into Canada. The French were basically gone. They did get a little bit here. They were able to keep this island down here, a couple islands in the West Indies, which does actually help for their sugar trade and their sugar plantations, but they are kicked out of this region up here. And earlier I said that this might be kind of bad that the French are kicked out of this region for the English. Yes, the English did get out of all of this land, but without the French here, there's nobody really to control Native Americans, and this leads to some serious conflict between Native Americans and English really for the next 100 years. Okay, the next section is Restless Colonials, and here's some key questions that I'm going to quickly highlight before we get into some of the details. One positive attribute the colonists gained following the French and Indian War: the colonists felt confident in their military training and their skills, gained more experience. This is going to be used 20 years later to fight the British in the Revolutionary War, and it shattered the British invincibility. So some of the colonists felt like, you know what, I think we can beat them if we go to war. Number two problems that arose between the British and the Americans during the French and Indian War. the biggest thing was friction between the English officers and the colonists. So again, we're starting to have a resentment towards each other. The British, for example, did not recognize any Americans above the rank of captain. Despite many Americans fighting valiantly during the war, they still did not feel like they got respected by the British. And just a quote from the British talking about the Americans is they insulted them, calling them the dirtiest, most contemptible, cowardly dogs. I need 2 put-ups now. Okay, and probably the biggest cause of colonial disunity was the distance between the colonies. Okay, the colonies, unfortunately, were not connected by very good transportation ways, and so it was difficult to communicate, and so that increased the disunity, which makes the revolution even more difficult. Okay, I already talked about much of this in the previous slide, so we gained confidence as Americans fighting. George Washington especially got a lot of experience, which helps in the Revolutionary War. Friction develops between the Americans and the British, and again, all of this is leading towards the revolution that's going to happen 12 years after the end of the French and Indian War. All right, there's a section, Makers of America the French. Just a couple quick highlights again. French in Canada either left when the British took over. They did swear allegiance to the British, and so they did stay put. Many of the French actually go down to New Orleans, and that's partly why we have the French Quarter down there today, because of the French heritage down there. And many of these people were called Cajuns because they were able to keep their language in New Orleans. So a little bit of the culture that the French did bring to North America. By 1840, many French Canadians actually go to America, to New England, to work in the lumber yards and the factories. So they do leave Canada. So there is a little bit of a French-Canadian feel and culture in New England. And even the city of Quebec today is mostly French-speaking. Okay, we have 3 more slides. This is the last section of reading. Americans, a people of destiny. Goosebumps, fire up for that. Wow, we are a people of destiny, but we think so highly of ourselves. So, a couple key things. This is a must-know and A-push. Pontiac's Rebellion, 1763. And so we have the Ottawa Chief Pontiac leads a violent campaign against the British in the Ohio Valley. Now, we know the French are gone now. The English took over, and Pontiac was unhappy with the English treatment against them. And so he goes on a rampage, if you will, with some of his followers, and they kill 2,000 colonists. That's an incredible amount of people that they killed in the back country. Okay, so I have connection, please. 1763-64, Western Pennsylvania. People are unhappy with Native Americans. They want more protection from the government back east. Anybody have a connection to this at all? Anybody? This actually relates to the Paxton Boys, the rebellion of the Paxton Boys, the revolution, the unhappiness because of Pontiac's rebellion against them. And so they basically start their own rebellion because of the lack of help from the eastern governments in Pennsylvania. Cause and effect moment here. The Proclamation of 1763 was created partly in response to Pontiac's rebellion. The British had a problem controlling Pontiac. Eventually he is captured, but they have a problem controlling him and Native Americans. So their solution is this. The Proclamation of 1763, the British said that the American colonists cannot, they are prohibited from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, and that really made Americans upset because, well, why did we fight in the French Indian War? We fought it partly to go into the Ohio Valley, and now we can't. So this makes many of the colonists very unhappy, and so they're angry. They defy the British. They still were going west, causing more conflicts. And finally, I just have down here, just read the last paragraph of the chapters. I think they're interesting, and the beautiful thing about our authors is typically the last paragraph or two, they make connection to the next major event or the next chapter. And so I'm just going to read it to you quickly. Lordly Britons, whose suddenly swollen empire had tended to produce swollen heads, were in no mood for backtalk. Puffed up over their recent victories, they were already annoyed with their unruly colonials. The stage was set for a violent family quarrel, and that's where we're going next, the American Revolution fire up. Okay, I already talked about a lot of this in the previous slide, the Americans, the people of destiny. Americans were coming out of the war with a new spirit of independence like teenagers. Okay, we were growing up as colonists. We felt that we were American, not really as much English, and so we are starting to getting the spirit of revolution. A couple key things: if France lost North America to the British, then maybe the British could lose it to the American colonies as well. Land-hungry colonials crossed the Appalachian Mountains. We talked about that. And they ran into conflict. Pontiac's Rebellion happened, and so that led to the Proclamation of 1763, which led to the colonists being very unhappy. And finally, and I mean finally, this is the last slide. Here again is that map. So the Spanish controlled the Southwest like they used to control. They also controlled Louisiana, and that's going to be important later in history. The key thing I wanted to highlight was the Proclamation of 1763. The colonists were forbidden to go west into the Ohio Valley, but being Americans, we tend to rebel, and we went across the line anyway, causing more conflict with Native Americans and making the British unhappy, which helps lead to the American Revolution 12 years later.